Hey, it's Neil O'Brien. I'm the author of After Disney, and you're listening to Scoop B Radio.
Scoopy Radio on the airwaves, on the plane, on the train, everywhere you need to be. I am your host, Braden Scoop B. Robinson, and today is a very, very special interview because I know this guy a little bit. He used to be my internship supervisor. He is an accomplished producer at NBC News, and he is now an accomplished author. He is the author of the book After Disney: Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of America's Favorite Media Company. He is Neil O'Brien. Brother, welcome to Scoopy Radio.
Hey, Brandon. Can I call you Brandon or Scoop? You're
They're
Brandon.
listen, they're interchangeable. If you haven't noticed, we know each other pretty well. Neil,
Yeah,
first of all, congratulations on your.
thank you. I appreciate it.
Um, Tell me something. When you were going through the research of this book, what did you find most fascinating in the gathering space?
Yeah, so I've been working on this book a long time, longer than I think even before I knew you. So about 17
Wow.
years. I
Okay.
think you were with us, I don't know, more than a decade ago.
Mhm.
And so it's been a long journey. A lot of that time is spent on research. This is not a company I've worked at. It's not a subject that I necessarily was intimately familiar with. So it took a lot of time to research the topic. And I think some of the things that surprised me were how much was unknown about a company that's so well known. The period of time that I'm writing about is in the period of time right after Walt Disney dies. It's before Bob Iger, it's before Michael Eisner largely. And it's this sort of period where uh, it just did not get discussed a lot. There's a lot of areas that just haven't been covered in depth. And so, really digging into this time period, learning about uh, the former CEO, Walt's son in law, Ron Miller, former athlete with the LA Rams, learning his backstory, which has not been told at all before, was really interesting. And I spent a lot of time learning who he was and how he rose to power, and then what happened once he got uh, to the top, and then when he left.
Sounds like the corporate ladder uh, in a world that existed before social media, before TV news became 24 hours of news coverage and more. How did your background and the experience working in news help you in research and shaping for this particular book?
So, as a journalist, you look for firsthand sources as much as possible. I conducted a lot of interviews for the book. I did speak to Ron Miller, the CEO, former CEO. I eventually spoke to his son, Walt Disney Miller, to really learn his story. I conducted dozens of interviews with filmmakers and animators who worked at Disney during this time period, and then also just documents, right? And it was a great journey, really fascinating journey, uh, talking to all these people who've been around a long time, who a lot of them are now nearing their end of their careers. A few people I talked to passed on in the time I was working on it. So conducting interviews, trying to stay journalistic about it, trying to stay, there are people who had conflicts and clashes back in the day, but just trying to hear out everybody's point of view and figure out maybe where their stories intersect and make sense together, and then also try to figure out where points of view maybe don't match up. And so I took a journalistic approach to this story.
This felt more like lawyer discovery mixed with journalism, if you will, looking for biases, looking for consistent storylines and more. Was it more phone and Zoom than travel? What was your schedule like in that whole discovery process?
So it was a lot of Zoom. The benefit of having my interview subjects on the West Coast while holding a full-time job on the East Coast was that I was able to do a lot of it after hours.
Mhm.
People were very generous with their times and their stories, which I was very appreciative of. There was some travel. I went to some of the places I wrote about. The California Institute of the Arts opened their doors for me and their archives for me. the Walt Disney Company. I also went through their archives, and so there was some on-site, a lot of virtual, and historical records that were all online as well.
How many pages, how many chapters in the book?
It's about 19 chapters plus a prologue and an epilogue, so we'll call it about 20. And it's just over 250 pages.
What was the hardest chapter? What was the easiest chapter?
The hardest chapter was the beginning. And this is why. Walt Disney dies in 1966, and originally my story was picking up in 1971, and I had like a 5-year gap, and I didn't know how to bridge it. And what helped me was a fellow historian was able to share some of his research with me, and that helped me bridge the storyline from the day Walt Disney dies until all the way really through the present day, but the story ends primarily in like 1985. But it does bring it all the way to the present at the very end.
When I was reading the bio of the book, there's a section that says, at the same time, the aging animation department, once the core of Walt's business, was one memo away from shutting down forever. Can you tell me more about that memo?
Yeah, so when Walt Disney died, he had cancer that was discovered late. November of 1966. He had been in pain for some time. He thought it was an old sports injury, a polo injury. And he died pretty quickly thereafter. By mid-December of 1966, he had passed. And the company, he had been thinking loosely, and the title of the book takes its name after Disney from a quote where Walt was talking to an interviewer in April 1966, and he talked about the company after Disney. And the interviewer at the time, an Australian journalist, was sort of puzzled by that and was like, "What do you mean after Disney?" And she said, he's still in the prime of his life, and it sounds like he's talking about death. And so his death took the company largely by surprise. And soon thereafter, his brother, who was the co-founder, met with one of his trusted aides and said, "We should shut down animation. Only Walt could make movies like this, and he's gone. And I want you to shut animation down." So if it had shut down at that point in late 66, we probably still would have gotten the Jungle Book because it was in development, about halfway through production. But everything since then would have not existed. So whether it's movies like The Lion King and Aladdin, or companies that sprouted out from the same time period like Pixar and DreamWorks, might not have existed at all. So that's what that is referring to, that memo. And instead, what happened was his animators who had been with him for decades put their heads together, and they're like, let's try to make one more after this. That movie became the Aristocats, which has a surprising celebrity following in this day and age of Snoop Dogg and Quentin Tarantino and the like.
Eclectic, if you will.
Yeah. And that movie basically gave them the lifeline to keep going. It was a hit right after The Jungle Book, which was also a hit. And then from there, they decided to reinvest in the future. And so they created a whole animation training department, both at the studio and then later at California Institute of the Arts. And from that sprang this new generation of animators who made most of the movies that probably you and I grew up with. That was also the genesis of companies like Pixar, and eventually, through other parts of the story, DreamWorks Animation.
So it's almost like, we've seen many rebrands over the years with Disney, most recently with Pixar, and just, a variation of other things, even to this point, the streaming services where you can watch Disney, or you can watch X-Men on the Disney app. So for many years, Disney has been able to rebrand itself, partner, and make things happen. And it seems like the early start there stood the test of time, and here we are today.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the brand, because the brand was something that Walt's son-in-law struggled with a bit. He wanted to make it more modern. It's something that Walt struggled with himself. When Walt saw the movie To Kill a Mockingbird in the early 60s, he sat there watching it with his family, including his son-in-law, Ron Miller, and he said, I wish I could make a movie like that. And it bothered him that he couldn't, but he felt that his brand had become so narrowly defined. And again, keep in mind, that's right in the middle of the civil rights era. And so To Kill a Mockingbird, which, you know, might be viewed a certain way today, was seen as controversial at the time. And he felt he couldn't touch any subject matter that the audience wasn't expecting from him. So Walt felt at times that he struggled with his brand. So his son-in-law spent a good part of his tenure trying to figure out how can we expand the Disney brand. Like nowadays, like you're talking about with Disney Plus, you know, you can watch X-Men 97 or things like that on Disney Plus, and it all kind of works together, even ESPN to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. All works within the Disney brand. In the late 70s and early 80s, that wasn't such a given. They really had to test things out. They struggled at times because not all their tests worked, but eventually they got to a point where they felt that their brand was elastic enough to include things that a decade ago might not be seen as quote unquote Disney.
Tell me something. In your research, did you find Walt Disney to be a disruptor or someone who played it more safe?
So he had big dreams, especially near the end of his life. You know, near the end of his life, California Institute of the Arts was supposed to be this place where all parts of the arts could come together, whether it's music, theater, fine arts. So that was one of his final dreams. Epcot, which was not supposed to necessarily be a theme park, it was supposed to be a city of the future. That was one of his final dreams. In fact, when he died, one of his aides commented about how, you know, so much seemed to be about to happen right near the end of his life. So in many ways, he was a disruptor. Having said that, there were times where he knew that his name, which was the name of his company, his brand, meant a specific thing to a large portion of his audience. It was, you know, built around family entertainment. In the 60s and 50s, that meant a very specific kind of entertainment. You know, it was before the rating system, but it was basically G-rated films, right? And, you know, so he did struggle with that a bit, while at the same time having really big ideas about what he thought could be held in the future.
Who would you compare him to in contemporary America or the global space today?
Oof, I don't know that I'm well equipped to answer that. There's a period of time where when I started this book, Steve Jobs sort of held a space in the collective imagination of also, you know, once in a generation visionary. I don't know that I've not done enough research to know if that comparison holds a lot of water or not. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there are figures throughout history who come along and they are both well known while also, you know, trying to push in their industry. And so I'll leave it to others to answer that. But I think there are comparisons probably to be made, and it probably depends on your point of view.
Author, visionary, producer, journalist, and overall good brother Neil O'Brien joins us today on Scoop B Radio, discussing his book After Disney, Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of America's Favorite Media Company. You made mention of the fact that you benefited from the West Coast and the fact that people are out West and you were able to balance life, what you do in your day job, also what you do at night. How involved was your family in that process with you and just writing and gathering?
So when I started the book, I don't even know, I wasn't even technically married yet. Okay. Right before our wedding, my wife and I went on a research trip to California. So that's way back when now. And about a year and a half ago, we went back on another research trip, this time with the kids. So they've been involved a lot. They've made definitely some sacrifices so that I could stay up late at night to interview people and write. The writing process was its own toil and trouble. And so I owe a lot to them. The book's dedicated to them.
Well, that's awesome to hear. A few more questions, as I know you're busy and news is your day job, but I'm curious. You talked about his son who played for the LA Rams, correct?
Son-in-law. Although he did
Okay.
on his death, when he was in the hospital near the end of his life, he called him his son, and a nurse tried to correct him and say, "You mean your son-in-law?" And he said, "No, I mean my son." And to Ron Miller, that was the greatest compliment he ever received.
Basketball is my jam, as it is your son's jam, as I know.
Yes.
But what did you make of Ron Miller? Is he still living? And did you talk to him?
He passed in 2019. I spoke to him around 2010. At the time, the book had a little more narrow focus, but he was generous with his time. But then as I revisited the book later on, I realized I needed more of his story. And by that point, he had passed away. So I had to track down his family, his son, who gave me background about his father. His son would tell you that he didn't know necessarily everything his dad was doing in terms of the business side of his life, but he gave me insight into his personality more and some other things that were happening, especially later on in life. After he left Disney in 1984, in what the family characterizes as a forced resignation, he was a fairly private figure. He retreated into a shell, I think is fair to say. And so when I spoke to him, I didn't even realize how unusual it was at that moment that he was granting me an interview. So I learned to really appreciate that after the fact. Yeah, I do have a basketball connection for you.
I'm all ears. Talk to me.
So I hope you know the movie. I'm sure you do. The Kobe movie, Dear Basketball, the Oscar-winning film.
Yes.
The co-director of that film was Glen Keane, the animator, who was the main subject of my book. One of the main subjects of my book. He was one of the first students at Cal Arts who was studying animation. He then went to Disney and was there throughout the 70s and 80s, and then into the Renaissance of the 90s. And so he's one of the key figures in my book. He left Disney more than a decade ago, and then went on to make Dear Basketball with Kobe.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go.
You work at news. You'll find this funny, as former vice president and former president Joe Biden said, that's a big freaking deal.
I just look for those connections for you.
No, man, I'm appreciative of this because put a lot of work into it. 200 plus pages of notes, blood, sweat, and tears, and just good hard work, and that's to be commended. And I'm honored that I'm the first interview that you've done on this book.
I'm honored that you let me be the first interview.
Of course, from you being my supervisor at NBC during my internship to us both being very successful in our fields, man, I consider it an honor.
And I do want to point out one thing about the book, but also relates here a little bit. A lot of the book, even though it's specifically about events at Disney and animation, which people may be interested in, even if they're not, ultimately the book's about the great expectations and burden of legacy and how that plays between mentors and mentees. And so hopefully that resonates with people, even if, they're not sure if they are interested in the subject matter or not. And as somebody who I've seen blossom as a broadcaster, it's nice that I'm really honored that you invited me to join you today.
Of course, I consider it an honor. I wasn't the best intern, but I became a better professional.
You're a great professional.
Yes,
You're
sir.
a good intern, Brandon, but you're a great professional.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Likewise. Make sure you all check out his book. It is everywhere you get your books. And congratulations, Neil.
Thanks, Brandon.
My pleasure.